there was like such tremendous resistance from physicians that I spoke to. I remember one doctor in a moment of complete honesty said, you know what, if you find like stage 1 lung cancer, I'm not sure I know what to do with that. You know, if I do the wrong thing, probably the patient will die. Whereas if you show me a lung cancer at the typical stage of diagnosis, there's not a lot that I can do. So I thought, you know, there's something here. And the more doctors were resistant to something that to me felt obvious, the more excited I was to really go after this space. So I found a radiologist up in Canada that were doing these experimental clinical diagnostic whole body screening exams. And it was sort of one of those light bulb moments. It just became obvious from that point that this is something that healthcare should be based around. And so I made it my mission from that moment on to go and find ways to bring this to as many people as possible.
What was the experience of the first users?
Yeah, I remember very clearly the first day because I was there, and the first person that we put in the machine, we found a cancer, but they were asymptomatic. So it was sort of this instant validation. The way we do healthcare is completely wrong. We spend, I think, $5 trillion in healthcare, and 95% of it is on reactive medicine. So I think we'll look back and just think that the way we approach disease, that is like waiting until it's symptomatic and advanced, was tremendously barbaric.
Andrew, it's a pleasure to see you on the podcast. I was waiting for a lot of time to do this discussion. I spoke with a lot of entrepreneurs in San Francisco, and so many times they bring up Prenuvo. So wanted to hear about your journey. So why don't we start about how did you start the company?
Sure. Well, it's great to be here, Kyriakos. Thanks for having me. How did the company start? Well, it really started with me going through something of a midlife crisis in my early 40s. I have a profile that I think a lot of people in Silicon Valley can relate to. You know, I moved to the US for the American dream. That is this notion that we work hard today to build sort of a better future for tomorrow. And I was on my 4th company that I had worked on, my 4th entrepreneurial venture. And for every single one of those, although I think I was getting better as an entrepreneur, I definitely wasn't changing my habits as it related to my health. So I was eating poorly. I was not sleeping anywhere near as much as I should have. I was exercising sort of very, very intermittently. And I remember just having this moment where I woke up one day and I looked in the mirror and I said to myself, wow, you know, I'm making all these efforts for tomorrow, but what guarantee do I have that I'm going to be around tomorrow? And so that started really my own personal exploration into, well, how do I get an answer to that question? And I discovered, as most of us know, that there are just this piecemeal of tests out there that you can do that might tell you something about a blood level or or, you know, you can do a colonoscopy or a PSA test, but there was just nothing that was very comprehensive, at least until I found a radiologist up in Canada that were doing these experimental clinical diagnostic whole body screening exams. So I got on a plane immediately and went and did one of these exams. And I just felt like it was the closest thing to a Star Trek like health experience than that I had ever experienced. After the exam, we sat down and went through every single organ in my body that, frankly, before that day, I'd never even looked at. So I felt like I was meeting myself for the first time, but then getting such a tremendous, amount of information about what was going on in every organ in the body. And that there were some things there that I knew about, which was always sort of reassuring. But then there were also health findings that I had no idea about because they're asymptomatic. And it just was it was sort of one of those light bulb moments. It just became obvious from that point that this is something that healthcare should be based around. And so I made it my mission from that moment on to go and find ways to bring this to as many people as possible.
What did you learn from that first MRI, and how was it different from the general MRIs that people do?
Sure. So let me start with the second question and then go back to the first. So how is it different? So the company uses custom research grade MRI machines that are fundamentally more powerful than what you see out there in imaging clinics. And in particular, the machine that we use enables us to image every organ in the body multiple times filtering for different tissue compositions. So we can filter for fat or fluid or blood or proteinaceous tissue and so on. And it's the combination of those filters when you look at any particular, let's call it lesion inside an organ, that enable us to be very accurate for what it is that we're seeing, whether this is something that's benign that we should do nothing about, or whether this is something concerning that we should then go and do some follow-up around. So the hardware itself is particularly unique. On top of that hardware, if anyone's been inside an MRI machine, you hear these beeps going on all the time. So that's something that's coded by software. And the software that we've built is, very uniquely purposed for whole body. And then finally, the last piece is the radiologists. And the radiologists are deliberately trained in whole body radiology. It's not a side business for them. It's their business. And this makes the exam overall just a lot more accurate. Now, what did I learn? I didn't learn that I was dying. I learned to appreciate and have peace of mind around my health. In spite of the way, if my body was an engine, I have been driving it in the red zone for quite some period of time. But it turns out that, although I needed an oil change and a few bits and pieces sort of modified, the engine fundamentally was not at risk of exploding at that point in time when I did my first scan. And that sounds, it's really hard to explain the feeling you get when you learn that you have more or less an all clear for life-threatening conditions. I felt like I was bouncing off the walls for weeks. The closest experience would be like the adrenaline you get from skydiving. It sort of lingers for like a week or two. And I just felt like I was part of a secret society that, I would sort of walk past people on the street, and inside me, my little inner voice would say, oh, that person doesn't know anything about their health, but I do. And it just gave me a lot, that peace of mind, I think, made me fundamentally a happier person by removing a lot of those worries that I, previously had no way of dispelling. And then, to be honest, I went back to working hard and probably treating myself not particularly great, but secure in the knowledge that I had this partner now, Prenuvo, that would at least alert me to where something serious was going on so I could, make an appropriate course correction if need be.
But Andrew, I understand the approach of, I understand that you saw the results and you basically saw the future and how the future needs to look like from that experience. But how do you really start building a business? Because it's a very expensive business to start.
Well, I should say, there was one moment that was sort of like a flag to the bull moment for me. And that's where I came back to San Francisco where I was living at the time. And I decided, wow, this is interesting. I want to talk to a bunch of doctors to get their perspective, because as an entrepreneur, the most valuable thing that you invest in a company is your time. And there was like such tremendous resistance from physicians that I spoke to. And if you asked enough why questions, some of those had legitimate concerns about the technology, but others were just like, I remember one doctor in a moment of complete honesty said, you know what, if you find like stage 1 lung cancer, I'm not sure I know what to do with that. And, if I do the wrong thing, probably the patient would die. Whereas if you show me a lung cancer at the typical stage of diagnosis, there's not a lot that I can do. So all of a sudden, like the decisions that the doctors make when, as it relates to earlier detection of disease becomes way more important. So I thought, there's something here, and the more doctors were resistant to something that to me felt obvious, the more excited I was to really go after this space and, help prove, through education and through exposing physicians to what we do that, actually there's an information asymmetry here. And, what you thought about MRI no longer holds true when you look at these exams. But then, I think what you're alluding to is then how do you get started? Because one of the challenges of lots of physicians being not particularly excited about these exams is almost every VC either has a physician on their investment committee or the investors on the investment committee have physicians that they will ask a question like, what do you think about these screenings? And because we obviously hadn't had the opportunity to speak with those physicians and show them what we were doing, the outcome was more or less negative most of the time. And so even though we had a business that in this one market in Canada was doing very well, we really struggled to raise money as a company from the traditional investors in Silicon Valley. So we ended up having to bootstrap that company. We got bank loans, we did personal guarantees,
Bank
and
loan.
yeah.
That's even more surprising. I would expect a bank to give you a very hard time to do that.
Well, this was a Canadian government bank, so it was perhaps a little bit more lenient on the sort of underwriting criteria, but they charged a lot of money for the loan, and we had cash flow. So for them, ironically, we were a lower risk than we were for VCs, who were somewhat blinded by what their personal physicians were telling them about the efficacy of these scans. So we took this money and we were able to open in the middle of COVID a clinic in Silicon Valley. And from that moment on, I mean, the trajectory of the company really started to pick up.
Super. And in that first clinic, what was the experience of the first users? And how did you pick the location specifically for that first one?
Yeah, I remember very clearly the first day because I was there, and the first person that we put in the machine, we found a cancer, a quite large cancer in them. They were asymptomatic. So,
wow.
So it was sort of this instant validation that we didn't expect to have happen, within the first couple of hours of the screening. So that obviously got us all very excited, and pretty soon, that became like a daily occurrence. In Silicon Valley, we had a lot more capacity now, and we were seeing more people. And some of these low probability events, cancer, aneurysms, and so on, we were starting to see more and more routinely. And not only as a company were we starting to tell ourselves, oh, like this product market fit here, and this is kind of exciting from a business point of view. I think it was also really exciting from a human point of view. And, from the very early days, we made this choice to, whenever we saved a life, we anonymized, obviously, the information about that person, but then we would tell everyone in the company. And to this day, we have a channel on Slack, it's called Why We Do This. And whenever we have a life-saving diagnosis, we just let everyone in the company know, and it's an all-of-company effort to make that happen.
And Andrew, for the first few people that learned about you, how did they learn? How did the word spread from the beginning?
It was primarily through word of mouth. And the goal really in the early days was, well, we were a really clinical company. So we really stood by the quality of the exam that we did. And when we opened this new clinic, we really started to focus also on the patient experience inside the clinic. And the goal here was sort of a very old-fashioned goal, which is, if you can come in and get a screening and believe that was the best thing you ever did for your health, ever, then you're going to want to tell other people about it. And think of the hurdle on that, right? Like, what's the last time you did like a medical test and you went and told all your friends, and showed them the results or showed them the imaging results? It never happens. But what we found was for the exam that we do at Prenuvo, it does. And we started to see these pockets of people coming in, and pretty soon we went from, obviously on day one, you have to sort of create demand, but we went to a position a few months in where the overwhelming majority of demand was just people that came in because they heard about us from someone else. And as we made cancer diagnoses from people in different suburbs, all of a sudden we've had have a whole bunch of people coming in from those suburbs, almost as if, the men that would go to sort of like the local football match were starting to talk about it, or the women who might hang out together are starting to talk about, like, someone's life that was saved. And we could really see this like virality happening real time. And I still to this day think that's phenomenal. Someone will take out a set of images that hide absolutely nothing, including all your private parts are there in tremendous detail, and want to pass it around the dinner table and show everyone because they're that excited about the exam.
Can we speak a bit about the technology as well? How does this work? And maybe fundamentally, what is an MRI?
Sure. So an MRI is essentially a hydrogen imager. So without getting too deeply into the physics here, almost all of the tissue in our bodies have some form of hydrogen in it. And depending on the molecules that hydrogen is bounded to, we can excite that hydrogen in a certain way. When we do that, we disrupt sort of the spin of the protons inside those hydrogen elements. And then when it relaxes back, it gives off a signal. And when a person lies in these machines, we put what we call coils, which are really a big set of antennas on their body. And those coils are able to pick up this really tiny signal that's given off by every of these hydrogen atoms in the body. And then we use a series of mathematical transformations called Fourier transformations to turn that into an actual image. And this technique, although it was invented 30 years ago, I think in the last 5 to 10 years has undergone such tremendous sort of like inventive steps. And in the field of imaging, it's definitely the modality that is being innovated more than anything else. So that's kind of how it works. It doesn't involve radiation. It's completely safe for our patients to come in. We don't inject anything in their body. So some people might have heard that there are contrast agents out there that are often used for MRI imaging, and those can accumulate in the body over time. So we don't like that. And the first part of your question, I forget. Maybe you could repeat that.
In general, differences. It was a fundamental of MRI, and maybe differences. Are there differences between different MRI techniques?
Well, first of all, there's differences between MRI and what people sometimes still do today, but did a lot more in the past, which is CT screening, whole body screening. And CT is a spinning X-ray. So X-rays are very good, as you could imagine, at seeing bones, but not tremendously good at seeing soft tissue. MRIs are very good at soft tissue, and in fact, don't really see bones. So it just so happens that the vast majority of cancers and diseases that you get in your soft tissue, not in your bone. And that's why MRI has always been regarded to be sort of like the top of the imaging pyramid. But being the top of the imaging pyramid means that it's also usually the last modality that people have if they're sort of in this mode of trying to figure out what's wrong with them. It's a slow modality normally. It's expensive. So people tend to start with, digital palpation. So basically pushing on the abdomen by a physician on a visit, then maybe ultrasound, then maybe CT, and eventually MRI. And so what we do, because we've sped MRI up so much, we're able to image a lot cheaper, that we've been able to invert that imaging pyramid. So we start with, in fact, the most sensitive modality. And that enables us to not only identify things earlier, but to arrive at a diagnosis a lot quicker than you otherwise would if you went down a typical care pathway.
I have the impression that when one goes to the doctor these days, usually they prescribe them first a CT, and if they cannot see or diagnose something, then they prescribe them an MRI. And I'm wondering if there is radiology on the first one. Why is that the sequence this way?
Because CT is just a lot faster. So CT scan takes couple of minutes, whereas an MRI can take 30 minutes to an hour. So ordinarily. So in general, this is about saving money. There's some parts of the body where CT is in fact better. So CT at the moment can do a much better job at evaluating the heart than MRI. But outside of that, in the soft tissue, MRI performs a lot better. So mainly it's a cost and time argument for using CT.
Interesting. In terms of the improvements that are happening in MRI over the years, where do you see, is AI playing a role here, or is it more of a hardware innovation that is happening?
No, it absolutely is. I would say there's been, at least for us in the screening world, 2 innovations that have been most helpful. The first is not AI based, but it's actually a technique called diffusion imaging. And this technique enables us to use the MRI machine to look inside the body for areas of hardness. And now, why is that helpful? Well, you might recall that women are often told to feel their breast for lumps. And if they feel a lump, go to their doctor. Not every lump is going to be a breast cancer, but every breast cancer is a lump. And so we know that solid tumors they're more dense than the surrounding tissue. And this diffusion imaging enables us to see that density anywhere inside the body. So it gives us a really clear signal of what can be quite small tumors in parts of the body that we don't have screening exams for, or are not able to actually sort of palpate ourselves with our own hands. So that was the first one. And that's more, I would say, intensive hardware-wise than it is involving AI. And I should point out that the vast majority of MRI machines in the market are not able to do diffusion imaging across the entire body. In fact, typically it's only one or two machines, sort of research machines at some of the really large, teaching hospitals that can do this type of imaging. Outside of those machines, it's frankly not even possible. And the second innovation really that does involve AI is the use of AI to speed up image acquisition. And we've benefited from this ourselves as a company. When we did the first whole body scan, it took 1 hour and 45 minutes. About 5 years ago, we got it down to about 1 hour and 10 minutes. Today, our screening exam takes 45 minutes. And in fact, we've added sequences in that we didn't have in the original product. So perhaps the original scan might take something like 30 minutes today. So AI is playing a big role in bringing down that acquisition time. And this is really important because these MRI clinics are very, very expensive to build, and the machines are very expensive to install and operate. And so the more people you can get through on a machine in a given day, the more you can spread those costs across a lot more people, bring the cost down for everyone.
I've read somewhere that you today have 13 locations that you operate in. How can you manage that? And what does this entail? Like, do you travel to these locations very often, or how do you build a team that does that?
Well, first of all, I don't manage them. At the outset, I have a really incredible clinical team. I have a chief medical officer that was a senior radiologist at Hopkins and was chief clinical officer at a health system over in Maryland. And he runs a team of clinicians that run the clinic and then radiologists that interpret the scans. And that's now quite a large team. And they have standard operating procedures and, very focused on making sure that the scan itself is done and conducted in a very safe way, that it has great reproducibility. What I mean by that is if you came in the second day and someone else took images of you, they would be the same quality images. And if another radiologist read the scan, you would get exactly the same results. And this is very important because radiology still is something of an art. It's not, it's a qualitative modality. It's not quantitative. So the training and the way that the radiologists read the exams is very important. So I have a team that does all of this. And frankly, they've, through trial and error, have figured out how to scale this from 1 clinic to 2 to 5 to 10. And we're now on a path to building another 20 clinics in North America.
Super. Now, I believe I read, and you mentioned at the beginning that it was very difficult to raise the initial funding, but I've seen that you raised another 70 million lately from very, very prominent investors. What do you think that changed, and maybe how did you change your personal pitch in these investors?
Well, I don't know if perhaps I'm not great at raising money because I definitely got way more no's than yeses, even in that fundraising round that we did. And I think their real challenge, now I'm an angel investor too. So, and I've had some angel investments come before me that I said no to that ended up being like decacorns. And I often have asked myself, kicked myself, and said, well, why didn't I invest in those companies? And I think the challenge really is, it's quite easy to tell a good company from a bad company. It's really, really difficult to tell a potentially transformative company from the worst idea ever. So if you think about sort of the distribution of companies as being like a normal distribution, in the sort of fat part of that normal curve, it's quite easy to tell this company's better than that company. But I think at both tails, they're sort of indistinguishable from each other. So the most transformative ideas always sound the most crazy at the beginning. And I think in healthcare, the types of ideas that were funded followed typically, a well understood formula, which is, they're point solutions that are designed to, be either slightly cheaper or slightly better than something else that's already covered by insurance in the market. And if you can do that, then you'll get insurance coverage, and so that your path to revenue will be obvious. we weren't that type of company. And we were saying, maybe this reactive way of healthcare is not the right way to do it, and maybe we should rebuild healthcare around proactive preventative medicine. And a lot of VCs were personally very excited to be customers, but from an investment point of view, just didn't really understand how that fit any of their existing thesis as an investor. So we had in that first round, we had a company called Felicis that led the round, and they're a consumer investor, and they had invested in 40 unicorns right across the spectrum, and they just were really on the lookout for those types of companies. But for that one yes, I got dozens and dozens of no's. So even when we raised that money, it was not obvious that we were going to be a successful company. And I think that's the story of a lot of entrepreneurs that are trying to raise money. Is just on the television shows, they don't show you how many times you get no as an answer, and that you have to pitch 50, 100 investors before you can pull together a round.
Yeah, I think the pitch refines over time, and you have to do that through a lot of no's. But I'm wondering, did they find different dynamics in the company? Was it because a lot of folks were doing the examination? Can you tell about what really convinced them afterwards?
Well, I think it was back to this idea, this nothing much had changed since we were just operating in Canada, which was every investment committee still had either a physician on it or they had doctors that they asked. And we had penetrated by that stage. We were getting a lot of interesting traction from consumers. But we were only just starting to reach out to physicians through those consumers to help educate them on why these scans are different. So it was still very early for sort of changing the hearts and minds of physicians back then. And that's what made it particularly difficult to raise money, if I'm being honest.
What learnings did you apply from, since you started other businesses in the past, what learnings did you apply that worked in this one that other founders can learn from you?
That's a great question. I mean, I feel much more capable now than I did during my first company, but I would say that every one of my companies has been completely different. So I have a lot of friends that are serial entrepreneurs that, sell a company and then 2 years later they start the same company more or less, and then sell it again and then start the same company more or less. So they have experience that they can apply to the subsequent businesses that they built. Every one of mine has been in a different industry. I'm an inherently sort of curious person, and although I think probably what my friends are doing is if the goal is to be rich, that's probably the best way to do it. But for me, I just find the thought of that very kind of boring at the end of the day. So unfortunately, I rarely have any actual industry experience that I bring to a new venture, but I'm just such an insanely curious person. I read a tremendous amount and talk to a lot of people. I have MRI imaging books here. If someone shows me an abnormality on someone's MRI image, I can do a pretty good job of guessing what that is now. So I just really thrive in or revel in the idea in sort of learning new things. I would say the main thing I've carried across from different startups is more emotional resilience. I remember with my first startup, when things would go bad, I really just felt like the world was ending. And when things was going great, I felt like, everyone was on the table dancing. And this emotional roller coaster, I think, is probably the most damaging thing for one's health. And what I've learned now, and there's good and bad to it, is that I've just gone through so many of these roller coasters that I sort of have become a little bit numb to the extremes, one way or the other. So if I have a bad day, if something goes wrong, it doesn't affect me anywhere near as much as it used to, because there's just been so many examples where the next day has been incredible, that I always, I wake up with the notion that, okay, it's a new day. What's going to happen today? The inverse is also true. I find it harder to celebrate the wins, because I've also seen the downs, the day after the win. So it sort of made me a much more level person. for better, which I think sort of is an important trait as an entrepreneur, because there are always ups and downs as you go to build something.
Super. And there was something else in terms of user acquisition. There were a lot of celebrities speaking about Prenuvo over time. I also heard on a different podcast that you were speaking that um, Prenuvo was not behind that. It was more of the celebrities learning about it by themselves. Have you ever figured out how did these folks started learning about Prenuvo?
Well, in some cases, yes. In some cases, no. In some cases, we've sort of traced the social connections. In some cases, they've been very open and said, "Hey, I heard about this from X or Y." But what's important about all these folks is that they more or less heard about us from someone. They were excited enough to reach out or to come in. Some of them come in under fake names, and so we don't even know they're coming in until the day they're in there. And many of them, if they have a great experience, just like everyone else, are excited to share it with the world. And particularly because many of these celebrities have such big audiences that, sharing a positive experience around a health product can literally change the course of many people's lives. And I think there's been a lot of excitement from some of these celebrities to do that, and we're super grateful. It's really sort of changed the landscape for preventive health, I think, in the last year.
Super. And in terms of the next 1 year and then the next 5 years, what should be people expecting from Prenuvo coming out?
Well, I think in the next year, the focus really is about just bringing the scan to more and more people. So we'll be opening more locations in the US, and we hope by the end of next year that there'll be a location within a comfortable distance from everyone living in the US. We also will start expanding internationally. So in the next 12 months, we have plans to open in Europe in a number of locations, in Australasia in a couple of locations. And so we'll start to bring these scans to folks that live in different continents, some of whom already today are flying in to get an exam. On the 5-year time frame, the thing that makes me most excited is a lot of the innovation that's happening in the MRI space, and the number of use cases continues to grow. And the things that we're able to see with these exams, I think, is we're only just scratching the surface of. And some examples of this are we are experimenting with a number of sequences that help us understand a lot more about cardiovascular health, which is something that typically you would get a CT for. But if we can do some form of screening using MRI, we can avoid that radiation as well. We're also doing a lot of experimentation around brain health. And here, the most that we know about age-related brain degeneration comes from some studies that really just studied Alzheimer's patients. And so we know a lot about late-stage disease, but we don't really know anything about early-stage disease. And so we're already running sequences on every patient that comes in that are the sequences that are run on Alzheimer's patients, so that we can get very, very detailed maps of their brains and really understand how those brains are changing over time. And in the future, we'll start to look at blood flow, and we're already starting to measure the cortical thickness on the outside of the brain. So we're really trying to peel back and find very early biomarkers of, there's potentially some disruption happening in the brain here, and can we identify it before you have brain volume loss? And if we can do that, then typically there are lifestyle modifications that may well, change the trajectory of your neurodegenerative health.
Super. Andrew, I always ask the guests, if we go 100 years into the future and we look backwards, what are the things that you would think that are totally wrong today?
Well, for me, it's easy. The way we do healthcare is completely wrong. We spend, I think, $5 trillion in healthcare, and 95% of it is on reactive medicine. We pilot these bodies that we inhabit with literally no cockpit telling us how we're doing. And so I think we'll look back and just think that the way we approach disease, that is like waiting until it's symptomatic and advanced, was tremendously barbaric. And in 100 years' time, getting a health checkup is going to be even easier than going to get your car checked. A 5-minute procedure once a year, and if you get a clean bill of health, you don't have to worry about anything. And if you don't, you catch it early and save both yourself and the health system a lot of money and much better outcomes for everyone. So I think that's going to be future. I don't think it's 100 years. I think it could be 20 years. But it's a radical shift from where we are today in the field of healthcare.
Super. Andrew, that's been a super insightful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kyriakos.